Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again this Independence Day week.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you on an occasion to celebrate the founding of the American independent country against tyranny and for freedom.
Yeah, and welcome to those of you that tune in regularly, as well as those of you that might be tuning in for the first time. As our longtime viewers know, the Future of Freedom Foundation's mission is to present an uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And you can access all of these Libertarian Angle shows, the archives on our website, along with a bunch of articles that we've been publishing since our founding in 1989. At fff.org, all of which present this uncompromising message for liberty. So, Richard, this was Independence Week. This is Independence Week. The 4th of July was Tuesday. So I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about it. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what Independence Day really is. I think probably the biggest is that a lot of Americans use this day to celebrate the military and to celebrate the government, and they look at it in terms of, boy, this is what patriots do. They support the troops and they support the military. That's what Independence Day is all about. But actually, it wasn't about celebrating the troops or celebrating the government. It was exactly the opposite. What Americans, a lot of Americans have been taught to believe is that the colonists living in the New World were American citizens, that they were sort of fighting an oppressive foreign power. Such was clearly not the case. These were not American citizens. The people who signed the Declaration of Independence were not great Americans. And why is that? Because they were not Americans at all. They were British citizens. They were as much British citizens as you and I are American citizens. They were simply British citizens living abroad. So when Independence Day came, these people living over here, or at least a large portion of them, it's been estimated to be maybe about a third of them, decided not to support the troops anymore. It was the exact opposite. They decided to fight the troops. So these were British citizens that started trying to kill their own troops, the British government's troops, in this quest for independence from the British government. I mean, really, it was more like a secessionist movement. They were trying to secede from the British Empire. And that was really what it was about. Now, here's another irony that I see about this whole picture, Richard, is that if you look at why these people wanted to secede from the greater empire, and you examine the causes for that they were citing for why they were declaring independence, the causes really are minuscule compared to what our own government is doing to us today. I mean, look, you've got the power to assassinate Americans, the power to torture Americans, to indefinitely detain Americans, all of which the Supreme Court or the federal courts have upheld. I mean, these are the types of things that King George had the power to do, but I mean, certainly it didn't seem as bad when you read the Declaration of Independence. I don't see anywhere in there where they talk about they're assassinating British citizens, and they talked in terms of things like destroying the right of trial by jury, which of course is what the U.S. government has done at Guantanamo Bay. So you've got this irony where Americans are celebrating Independence Day in sort of the wrong way. I mean, what we should be celebrating is a group of people stood up against their own government. That's the principle involved here, that when your government is in the wrong, patriotism means standing up against that government. It doesn't mean supporting the government. It means standing up for it and have the courage to stand up for it and get the government on the right track. And that's what the Declaration of Independence says. It says that whenever any government, that includes the U.S. government, becomes destructive of the legitimate ends of the people, that is, the destructive of the fundamental rights and liberties of the people, the right to pursue happiness, the life and liberty and property, then it is incumbent on the people to take a stand against it, try to set it on its right track, and if the government refuses to get on the right track, to alter or abolish that government and institute new government, limited government, that is designed to protect the liberties of the people instead of destroy them. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that your point is an important one to emphasize, is that the colonists on the eastern seaboard of North America had objected to taxation without representation. They had objected to the British government housing British soldiers in their private homes without their voluntary consent. They objected to what today we call the mercantilist regulations on the right of the colonists to trade with parts of the world outside of the British Empire and not on British vessels, so British ship owners could have monopoly trade profits. They objected to the intrusiveness, as you were saying, abrogations of a variety of civil liberties, the judicial system, the British Crown usurping their right of self-government in their local legislatures. But all of their objections to these things were based on the idea that they were British subjects, and there was a tradition of the rights of an Englishman that had emerged in the history of Great Britain from the time of Magna Carta centuries before. And that what the British Crown and the Parliament were doing was violating the sacred rights which any Englishman should be viewed as having an inherent right to, whether that Englishman was in London, England, or in Boston or Philadelphia. So that you're absolutely right. They were rebelling against the abrogation and violations of liberty by their own government. And it should also be pointed out is that while we say, oh, they signed the Declaration of Independence, they were determined to break away, even many of those who ended up supporting independence and therefore a revolt against British rule, their own government's rule, did not want to rush into this. There was a deep sense of attempts at reconciliation, compromise, petitioning the king. And it's only when King George III made it very clear that what the colonists, those Englishmen in North America, were viewing as compromises and attempts to go halfway were unacceptable to him, that they still seemed as abridgments of his authority and that of the Parliament that supposedly represented him. Only then they decided that this was the end of the road. There is no way to get the king to acquiesce in ending these violations of their liberty, of the rights of an Englishman. And therefore, it was the final recourse, not the first one. Now, there were firebrands, such as John Adams and others, and Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who in their own ways were reluctant, but all were radically for this. But this was a long process of attempting to get their own government to respect the rights that every Englishman was expected to have respected by their own government. So that this was a revolt against it. The other element in this that you refer to, patriotism, a celebration of the military, waving the flags in a parade in Washington, D.C., as they used to do. When the Founding Fathers referred to these self-evident truths, that we are all created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and governments are formed to secure these rights and not to abridge them. And if governments continue or introduce abridgments, and after a long redress, no solution can be found, the final right of the people is to revolt against their own government. It's important to realize what these Founding Fathers meant by right of self-government. They certainly meant what today we call about political government. We get to elect the representatives who are supposed to enforce the laws to secure our liberty rather than violate them. But more fundamentally, what they talked about self-government was their notion of your inherent right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is your right, your natural right, to be self-governing as a free individual, to peacefully go about selecting your own goals, purposes, ends, and desires that will give your life fulfillment in your pursuit of happiness. That men are to be respectful of each other's lives and property. That is why government is formed among them. And Jefferson made it very clear that he wasn't creating a new concept. He was drawing upon the tradition of over a century by then, or about a century by then, particularly from John Locke's second treatise on government, in which he spoke of the natural rights of an individual. That liberty was the right of the individual to be sovereign over himself, act on his own, choose the appropriate means, use the property that he has either taken from virgin land or has acquired peacefully with others to go about his own affairs, and that each individual being sovereign must respect the independence of the other, and that is why proper relationships among free men is voluntary agreement and mutually agreed upon terms. I may not invade you. You are sovereign over yourself, your life, your property, your decisions on to whom to associate, for what purposes, and why, on the terms that you find satisfactory with them, which you may find unacceptable with me, and I may not force you to do so. That is the deeper sense of what American freedom means. And that is revolutionary and new and specific to the American experience. If there's any meaning, in my opinion, to the phrase American exceptionalism, what makes us as a country stand out historically in the flow of human history from other countries, other nation states, other empires of the past, is that ours was founded not with the idea that the king rules through divine right or conquest alone through the brute force of power, but that individual human beings have rights. And if government exists, that is, that legitimized authority of compulsion and force, it exists to secure people's freedom and not to abridge them. And if government does abridge it, it has failed in its function for which it exists, and therefore the people have a right to overthrow it. It was with that last desperate measure that these founding fathers decided to issue their Declaration of Independence with their enumerated grievances. This week on the FFF website was posted an article of mine called A Declaration of Independence Against Big Government. A theme that I made of this article is that we all know those open lines about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the bulk of the document, and it's only one long page, is their grievances. And what were their grievances? And they're not only civil liberty issues come up, but it is primarily economic liberty. Property rights are abridged. Right of freedom of association and exchange is abridged. Taxes are oppressing the people. The government is sending over a swarm of locust bureaucrats to manage and control and manipulate their social and economic affairs. That is what they were revolting against, to be free individuals in voluntary association with each other, in a global association of trade and commerce and betterment, and to create a new government that would secure it and not violate it, as they saw Parliament and especially King George III.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head about the central importance of the verbiage that Jefferson used in the Declaration of Independence with respect to fundamental rights.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, countless books have been written on the military battles that took place between, Washington's troops and the British troops, but really those are of secondary importance. The real importance of the Declaration of Independence was that message that Jefferson just sent all over the world. I mean, and ever since it has terrified governments, because as people start to process this and think about it, all of a sudden this age-old mindset, which unfortunately afflicts all too many Americans today, that government has a legitimate authority to control people's lives. That freedom is looked more as a privilege from the government, which the government can regulate, the government can suspend sometimes in an emergency or a crisis. Jefferson is saying something completely revolutionary, as you say, and it shocked the world. He's saying, look, man has been endowed by God or by nature with certain inherent fundamental rights. So we don't have to be grateful to the government for our rights. We don't have to be grateful to the troops for our rights, because our rights don't come from the government or from the troops. Our rights are inherent to our nature or endowed in us by a God. Now, what are these rights? Well, we've got life, the opportunity to live life the way you want. We've got liberty, the right to engage in any kind of peaceful pursuit that you want. You can't go out and interfere with somebody else's right to live his life, like through murder or rape or theft. But as we libertarians have always said, that means anything that's peaceful, that this is your fundamental right. And of course, you drew on John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. He talked in terms of life, liberty, and property. Um, Jefferson modified that to the pursuit of happiness. But notice something really critical about this, Richard. He's not saying Americans are endowed. He's saying all men everywhere are endowed with these fundamental rights. That frightens the dickens out of tyrannical governments, governments that have become accustomed to controlling, for example, the economic affairs of people through controls and regulations, or suppressing speech, or controlling any other manner, drug laws and so forth. Jefferson is turning that upside down and saying, you don't have the authority, government officials, to infringe on rights that pre-exist government. And so he asks, why are governments even brought into existence? And there's really just one reason, is to protect the exercise of these fundamental, pre-existing, inherent, God-given rights. That's its only function. So we, as libertarians, we wouldn't have any trouble with government punishing a murderer, or a rapist, or a thief, because he's trying to take away our pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson points out that oftentimes government becomes destructive of the liberties of the people and the rights of the people. And that's when it is the fundamental right of the people to alter that government and set it back on its right track. So the mindset under the Declaration is the citizen is sovereign, as you use that word. He's the boss. The government is the mere servant. And unfortunately, Richard, in our time, that became turned upside down. For example, just one example, take the income tax. For over 100 years, Americans were free to keep everything they earned. There wasn't anything the government could do about it. I mean, you made it, you kept it, and you decide what to do with it. There was no welfare state, mandatory charity, and so forth. So the individual in that sphere was sovereign. He goes out and engages in economic activity. He keeps his own money. He decides what to do with it. The government is the servant. It's there to protect him as he's accumulating wealth and deciding what to do with it. With the adoption of the income tax in the 20th century, that relationship was turned upside down. Now the government is sovereign and the individual is really just the serf, because the government decides how much he's going to be able to be permitted to keep. Now it looks like they're just setting a percentage that they're going to take, but actually in reality they're setting the percentage of what people are going to be permitted to keep, because they have the prerogative of setting the percentage at wherever they want. And so this is why, as libertarians, I think we've got a much better sense of what we need to do in terms of celebrating Independence Day, and that is to do some fundamental examination of what's happened to American society, how our own government has destroyed freedom across the board in terms of drug laws, income taxation, economic controls, national security state, foreign wars, out of control spending, and the like, and then lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom by achieving it here, not violently, as you point out. Jefferson says, people don't turn to revolution lightly. They know there's death and destruction involved with it. But I think we have an opportunity in our lifetime, Richard, to lead a revolution of ideas, a peaceful transition, revolutionary transition to a free society as originally envisioned in those principles set forth in the Declaration.
Yeah, I just should mention one little thing. The original Declaration of Independence is now an old document in the literal physical sense, and it has been fading. And researchers have recently realized that after that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there's an asterisk. And if you look at the bottom of the page carefully with the fading parchment, the asterisk says, these rights belong to all except those with the last name Hornberger, who may originally have come from Laredo, Texas. So it seems you're the only one that government is allowed to oppress.
Maybe so.
But I think if I can continue with that analogy of sovereignty, this concept is in a sense still given lip service to, at least, in international affairs. The idea is that one nation is not supposed to, let's put it this way, the government of one nation is not supposed to interfere into the internal affairs of another sovereign nation state. It doesn't mean that you like what that other nation state does, or the laws it passes, or the problems its own citizens may have with its own government. But the idea is that unless you want to have a situation of constant, to use a phrase, perpetual war among nations, because you don't like how other governments manage their own internal affairs, you must have a general principle that no matter how repugnant you may consider the conduct of another government, your government, representing those citizens, does not interfere with another nation. Now, that logic should be viewed as coming from the idea that the individual is sovereign. So the idea if each individual within a country is sovereign and may not interfere with how his neighbor is going about his private and peaceful affairs, then his own government should not. And then logically, another government should not interfere into a country whose own government is protecting the rights of its own citizens. Now, if a government is not recognizing the rights of its own citizens, and this gets to the more modern foreign policy aspect of what we've been talking about, then it is not the duty of the United States government to arrogantly presume to interfere in the affairs of a nation, another sovereign nation, because of what that sovereign government may be doing to its own citizens. It falls upon primarily the citizens of that own country to try to set its own affairs right. But what about the individual who is concerned about humanity and feels a sense of obligation as a human being to want to assist to overcome the oppression of others in other lands? In a free society that is consistently following the ideals of the type of liberty that we're talking about, that individual should have the latitude and liberty to peacefully make his own decision, not imposing it upon his own fellow citizens of his country. If he wants to donate money to a rebel group in another country, if he wants to supply medical assistance to an oppressed people who are opposing their own government, if he wants to volunteer, either for free or for money, to assist those who are being oppressed in another land, that is his free right as an individual. He is choosing to help his neighbor overcome problems in that neighbor's own neighborhood. But it should not be the idea that that individual's government can be persuaded or made to interfere and drag the entire population of that country into the internal affairs of another nation when the members of that first country may have disagreements. Is this a just cause? Who is in the right? Is it that oppressive that the people of that country should be risking the endangerment of death and destruction? Now, I don't want to get into the whole thing, but conceptually, how bad is Assad in Syria? Has the attempt to overthrow him been worth the destruction of seemingly most of Syria's major cities? Hundreds of thousands of people killed, according to these international humanitarian organizations, the displacement of millions of people, and creating vacuums that have enabled wacko organizations like the fanatical Islamic State to grab territories and impose and superimpose their own totalitarian fanaticism on everything else going on to the country. But by the United States or Britain or France, as they did with overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya, presuming to know what those people needed, and then to use the resources of tax money and the resulting military power of their own country to assist in overthrowing that government, you open a Pandora's box. Now, Assad may be as oppressive as his opponents say. The same way Gaddafi was surely oppressive, as many in Libya were critical of. But to have your own government interfere into the affairs of other nations potentially opens these Pandora's boxes. And you then drag your whole own country into that other country's affairs. If I want to go and donate to the rebel cause against Assad, financially, as I said, even voluntarily, then that's my choice. I may be risking my life. I may be expending my accumulated wealth in some humanitarian assistance. But I'm not dragging all the rest of the people of the United States into the vortex of a conflict, the outcome of which cannot be certain from the start. I mean, we've had these situations over the skies of Syria of Russian and American planes and the breakdown of communication. Russian planes and their American planes. What if this led, by the accidents of history, into a war, into a global war? That is part of the danger. The sovereignty of the individual, governments limited to respect that individual, peaceful, voluntary, associative sovereignty, and international affairs in this way need to be privatized too, in the sense that citizens must decide on what they view as good causes and the means by which they may want to assist it, and not suck their entire fellow citizenship into this through government foreign interventions.
Yeah, yeah, your point is very well taken. I mean, the dark irony of all this foreign interventionism and really imperialism is that it has brought about the destruction of liberty of the American people. So you've got Americans on Independence Day celebrating, oh, the troops in Iraq and the troops in Afghanistan, and the troops in Syria, while they don't realize that what they're celebrating is the destruction of their own freedom on Independence Day. And Madison, the crafter of the Constitution, points out that of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest because it encompasses all the rest. So look at the out of control spending, the debt that is threatening bankruptcy for the United States. I mean, a large part of this is not just the welfare state, but it's the warfare state. And the other dark irony of this whole process, Richard, is that the U.S. government has essentially become like the British Empire was at the time the Declaration was signed. I mean, you've got troops all over the world, bases all over the world. Now, they haven't followed the British model of imperialism exactly. They don't put an American in charge in Iraq and an American in charge in Afghanistan. Instead, what they did was they copied the Soviet model in Eastern Europe, that you find a local lackey to be the ruler that's going to be responsive to Moscow. That's what the U.S. does. It has these regime change operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. It's not about freedom. It's certainly not about the freedom of the American people, because nobody over there is threatening American freedom. And it's not about the freedom of the local citizenry. It's about control, putting our dictator in so that he does the bidding of the U.S. government and the United Nations whenever they need a coalition of the willing and so forth. And your point about individuals taking the responsibility of their own beliefs if they see tyranny and oppression overseas is another fantastic point. Because look, take Korea right now. You got 25,000 U.S. troops in Korea that are really serve as a tripwire. If there's a war there, that automatically commits the U.S. to the war. That's their purpose. They're sacrificial lambs. That's their only purpose. And then you have the Vietnam War. Now ask yourself, if the U.S. government had not embroiled the United States into the Korean War in the 50s, if they had not embroiled the United States in the Vietnam War in the 60s, how many Americans would have voluntarily gone over there to fight on the side of the South Vietnamese and the South Koreans? Absolutely zero. And that's why they had to turn to conscription. That's why they have to turn to these little tricks of putting tripwire troops over there to guarantee that the United States as a country will be automatically committed to these conflicts. And as bad as the Syria situation is, as you point out, you could have an accident leading to a war between Russia and the United States. It's actually even, I think, more dangerous in Korea, where you've got tensions rising by the day, along with an erratic president and a Pentagon that would love nothing more than to have a regime change of that communist regime in North Korea. And all of this goes back to the idea that the United States started copying the role of empire in the 20th century, or to be more exact, after the Spanish-American War in 1898.
If I can just give an example of what you were saying, how many Americans would have just chosen to voluntarily go fight in Vietnam or Korea in those wars if not for the U.S. government's participation? In 1979, I was a graduate student and teaching part-time at Rutgers University. And in a class, that I was teaching. I don't remember now how. The issue came up, as it was splashed all over the newspapers, the kidnapping of those Americans with the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, with the coming to power of Ayatollah Khomeini. And oh, the students were saying in the class, we have to do something. We have to teach those Iranians a lesson. And I said, okay, how many of you are willing as private individuals to volunteer to go undertake some type of overt or covert military action yourselves with some others who may choose to join you to free those American hostages? Not one hand was raised in class. Oh, talk is cheap when you're risking other people's lives and other people's financial fortune.
Yeah, it's like we have to be tough, and we, meaning the troops, the government. So, well, on that note, Richard, we're out of time. Did you want to make one
Okay.
last comment?
No, I just that I hope everyone has enjoyed this 4th of July week, and will look backwards and have a deeper sense of what this is all about: the liberty of the individual and the attempt to limit government when necessary to preserve that freedom.
Yeah, we want to look at the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence and the concept of patriotism from the libertarian perspective of
Absolutely.
deciding what should be the role of government in a free society. What does it mean to be free? And when we start debating and asking those questions, we're on the way to building on what they started back in 1776 and leading the world to those higher reaches of freedom. On that note,
Absolutely.
Richard, great to talk with you again. I'll see you next week.
Till next week.